She'd been scanning barcodes and bagging groceries for 4 years, watching the same faces come and go with their weekly routines. The other cashiers thought Margaret was just naturally observant, the way she remembered every regular customer's preferences and could spot a shoplifter from 3 aisles away. They didn't know that for 12 years, she'd profiled serial killers for the FBI, reading human behavior like a language most people never learn to speak. Welcome to Whispers of Lives. Before we begin this incredible story of a grocery store cashier whose gentle smile once helped capture the most dangerous predators in America, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe that true protectors never stop watching over us, hit that subscribe button and share this story to help us honor those who keep us safe from the shadows. Margaret Chen adjusted her name tag and smoothed down her blue Brookshire's market vest, the same routine she'd followed every morning for the past 4 years. Lane 3 was her domain, strategically positioned to observe the main entrance, the pharmacy, and the customer service desk. Most people assumed she'd requested the location for convenience, but Margaret had chosen it for the sight lines. Old habits died hard. The morning rush was beginning, familiar faces flowing through the automatic doors like clockwork. Mrs. Henderson from Oak Street, always buying enough frozen dinners for one but greeting everyone like family. Tom Riley, construction worker, energy drinks and protein bars, recently divorced based on a switch from family-size purchases to single servings. Jessica Martinez, young mother, organic everything, stress indicators increasing over the past month. Margaret cataloged each customer automatically, a mental database she couldn't turn off even if she wanted to. 12 years with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had rewired her brain to see patterns, anomalies, the tiny behavioral tells that separated normal people from predators. "Morning, Margaret," called Sandra, the cashier in Lane 4. "Ready for another fun day in paradise?" Margaret smiled, the same pleasant expression she'd perfected since leaving Quantico. "Always ready. How's your daughter's soccer season going?" Small talk, normal interactions, the kind of civilian life she dreamed about during those years of hunting monsters, when sleep came in 2-hour intervals and nightmares wore human faces. Her first customer was Dr. Valdez, a pediatrician who shopped every Tuesday morning before his clinic opened. Yogurt, fresh fruit, whole grain bread, consistent with someone who practiced what he preached about healthy living. No concerning patterns, no red flags. Just a good man buying groceries before saving children's lives. "How's the practice, doctor?" Margaret asked, scanning his items with practiced efficiency. "Busy as always. Flu season starting early this year." He swiped his credit card, the same one he'd used for 4 years. "Your register always seems to move the fastest. Other stores should train their people like you guys do." If only he knew that her training had come from analyzing crime scenes and interviewing serial killers, not corporate workshops on customer service. After Dr. Valdez left, Margaret's attention shifted to a man she'd been watching for the past 3 weeks. Mid-40s, average height, forgettable features, exactly the kind of appearance that allowed someone to blend into crowds without being remembered. He shopped alone, always during off-peak hours, and his purchasing patterns had been setting off alarm bells in Margaret's trained mind. Today, like the previous visits, he was buying cleaning supplies, industrial-strength bleach, rubber gloves, plastic tarps, duct tape, items that individually meant nothing, but together formed a pattern Margaret recognized from a dozen case files. He approached her lane with a cart full of seemingly innocent household goods, but Margaret's pulse quickened as she began scanning each item. Hydrogen peroxide, lime, heavy-duty trash bags, a hacksaw from the hardware section. "Find everything you needed?" she asked pleasantly, her voice betraying none of the tension coursing through her system. "Yes, thank you." His voice was soft, polite, unremarkable, but his eyes never made contact, a behavior Margaret had observed in subjects who struggled with normal human interaction. doing some home renovations. The lie was smooth practiced, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd told it before. Margaret continued scanning items, her mind racing through behavioral indicators. The slight tremor in his hands when he reached for his wallet, the way he positioned himself to observe other customers while pretending to focus on the transaction, the fact that he always shopped alone but bought enough supplies for a much larger project. "That's a big renovation," Margaret commented casually. "Must be quite a project." For just a moment, his composure slipped, a micro-expression of surprise, followed by a flash of something darker before the pleasant mask returned. "Yes, well, you know how these things go. One project leads to another." Margaret had seen that look before, in interview rooms at Quantico when suspects realized they'd revealed more than intended. She finished scanning his items, her training screaming warnings that her civilian life couldn't act upon. "Your total is $127.83. He paid in cash, exact change, the bills crisp, and knew like someone who'd visited the bank specifically for this transaction. Another small detail that meant nothing to most people, but everything to someone trained to see patterns. "Have a great day," Margaret said, handing him his receipt. "You too." He pushed his cart toward the exit, movements careful and controlled, like someone consciously managing their body language. Margaret watched him leave, memorizing details automatically. License plate number, vehicle make and model, the slight limp that favored his left leg, the way he checked his mirrors before pulling out of the parking space. 20 minutes later, her shift supervisor approached the register. "Margaret, can you take your break? We've got coverage." She nodded, stepping away from the register for the first time that morning. Instead of heading to the break room, Margaret walked to the customer service desk where the store's security monitors displayed feeds from the parking lot cameras. "Hey, Carol," she said to the customer service manager. "Could I get copies of the parking lot footage from this morning? I think someone might have hit my car." It was a lie, but Carol didn't question it. A few minutes later, Margaret had clear images of the mysterious customer's license plate and a good view of his face as he loaded groceries into his trunk. Back at her register, Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. The purchasing patterns were consistent with someone preparing for body disposal, the kind of systematic approach she'd seen from organized killers who planned their crimes methodically. But she couldn't be certain without more information, and she couldn't investigate without revealing her background. She'd left the bureau after the Morrison case, when 3 months of profiling a child killer had finally broken something inside her that wouldn't heal. The nightmares had started then, along with insomnia and the panic attacks that made it impossible to focus during critical interviews. Her supervisor had been understanding. Burnout was common in the unit, but Margaret knew she was done. For years of scanning barcodes and asking about paper versus plastic had been therapeutic in ways she couldn't have imagined. The routine was comforting, the human interactions positive, the biggest crisis usually a rejected credit card or a coupon that wouldn't scan. But patterns were patterns, and predators were predators, and some things couldn't be unseen once you'd learned to recognize them. During her lunch break, Margaret drove to the public library and used their computers to access databases she technically no longer had authorization to query. Old passwords still worked. Security protocols she'd helped design still recognized her digital fingerprints. The mysterious customer's name was David Fleming, and his record was clean. No arrests, no warrants, not even a parking ticket. But Margaret dug deeper, using techniques she'd perfected during her bureau years. Social media profiles, employment history, financial records that painted a picture of a man who existed on paper but left surprisingly few traces in the digital world. That itself was a red flag. In an age where everyone left electronic footprints, people who managed to remain virtually invisible usually had reasons for their discretion. She cross-referenced Fleming's address with recent missing persons reports, her stomach tightening as she found 3 cases within a 20-mile radius of his residence. All women, all between the ages of 25 and 35, all last seen leaving work or running errands in the evening hours. The timeline fit Fleming's shopping pattern. Supplies purchased in the days before each disappearance, then a gap of several weeks before he returned to the store. Margaret stared at the screen, her civilian life warring with her professional instincts. She had no authority, no badge, no legal standing to pursue this investigation. But she also had 3 families who deserved answers, and possibly a 4th victim if Fleming's pattern continued. She printed copies of the missing persons reports and Fleming's information, stuffing them into her purse before returning to work. The afternoon shift passed slowly, her mind churning through possibilities, while her hands automatically scanned items and counted change. At 6 p.m., Margaret clocked out and drove to Fleming's address, a modest house in a neighborhood that balanced respectability with anonymity. No close neighbors, mature trees that provided privacy, a detached garage that could easily conceal vehicles or activities. She parked 2 blocks away and walked back, her movements casual despite the adrenaline flooding her system. This was dangerous. If Fleming was what she suspected, confronting him alone would be suicide. But she needed more information, needed to confirm her suspicions before deciding how to proceed. The property was well maintained but eerily quiet. No signs of normal household activity. No lights in the windows despite the approaching darkness. No car in the driveway, though the garage door was closed. Margaret was circling around to observe the backyard when she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze and transported her instantly back to interview rooms and crime scenes she'd spent for years trying to forget. Screaming, muffled, coming from somewhere beneath the house, but unmistakably human and filled with terror. Margaret's training kicked in automatically, overriding 4 years of civilian caution. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice steady despite the circumstances. 911, what's your emergency? This is Margaret Chen, former FBI behavioral analyst, badge number 2847. I need immediate police response to 1247 Maple Street. I have probable cause to believe there's a kidnapping in progress. Victim in immediate danger. The dispatcher's tone changed when she mentioned FBI. Ma'am, are you currently law enforcement? Retired, but I'm trained and I'm certain about what I'm hearing. Someone is being held against their will in the basement of this residence. Units are being dispatched. Please maintain a safe distance from the residence. But Margaret was already moving toward the house, her civilian clothes and grocery store name tag forgotten. She'd spent 12 years learning to think like predators, and she knew Fleming's type. If he suspected he'd been discovered, he'd eliminate evidence, and evidence, in this case, meant human lives. She found a basement window on the side of the house, partially obscured by overgrown bushes. Through the dirty glass, she could see Fleming standing over a figure bound to a chair, his movements methodical and terrifyingly calm. Margaret recognized the victim from the missing persons photos. Sarah Winters disappeared 6 days ago after leaving work at a downtown law firm. She was alive but obviously terrified, Fleming circling her like a predator savoring his control. The scene was horribly familiar, matching crime scenes Margaret had analyzed and victim testimonies she'd recorded. Fleming wasn't just a killer. He was a sadistic predator who derived pleasure from his victim's suffering. In the distance, sirens approached, but Margaret knew they might not arrive in time. Fleming had heard them too, his head turning toward the sound with the alertness of someone accustomed to evading capture. He moved toward Sarah with increased urgency, pulling something from his pocket that gleamed in the basement's harsh lighting. Margaret didn't hesitate. She picked up a landscaping stone and smashed the basement window, the sound echoing through the night air. FBI. Step away from the victim. It was a lie. She hadn't been FBI for 4 years, but her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. Fleming spun toward the broken window, his expression shifting from calm control to rage. "You have no right. This is private property. David Fleming, you're under arrest for kidnapping. Step away from Sarah Winters immediately." "You don't understand," Fleming snarled, his careful mask finally slipping. "She needs to learn. They all need to learn." Margaret had heard variations of that justification from dozens of killers, the twisted logic they used to rationalize unspeakable acts. But she'd also learned how to respond, how to use their own psychology against them. "You're right, David. I don't understand, but I want to. Help me understand why Sarah needs to learn." The question caught him off guard, his weapon lowering slightly as his ego responded to the implied request for explanation. Margaret had used the same technique in interview rooms, appealing to suspects need to be understood while buying time for tactical teams to position. "She ignored me," Fleming said, his voice taking on the petulant tone of someone who'd never learned to handle rejection. "They all ignore me. Walk past like I don't exist." "That must be very painful," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But Sarah sees you now, doesn't she?" Police lights flashed through the basement windows as units arrived, but Margaret kept talking, keeping Fleming's attention focused on her rather than his victim. "The other women, David, did they see you too?" Fleming's eyes lit up with the fervor of someone finally given an audience for his grievances. "Oh yes. By the end, they all saw me very clearly." It was a confession, delivered with the pride of someone who'd never expected to be caught. Margaret continued engaging him, each word buying precious seconds while officers surrounded the house. "Margaret Chen, FBI. The voice came from upstairs, agents calling out her name as they breached the main floor. "Suspect is in the basement." Fleming's face twisted with betrayal and rage. "You lied to me." "No, David. I just didn't tell you I was retired." The basement door burst open, tactical officers flooding down the stairs with weapons drawn. Fleming dropped his knife and raised his hands, the fight leaving him as he realized his game was finally over. Margaret climbed through the broken window as officers secured the scene, her grocery store vest incongruous among the FBI windbreakers and tactical gear. Sarah was alive, traumatized but physically unharmed, already being attended to by paramedics. Agent Chen, one of the tactical officers, approached her with obvious confusion. "Dispatch said you called this in, but you're not on our active roster." "Retired 4 years ago," Margaret explained. "I work at Brookshire's market now. Been watching this guy's purchasing patterns for weeks." The officer stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in a grocery store uniform with someone who'd just solved a serial kidnapping case. "Ma'am, with all due respect, how did you know?" Margaret looked around the basement, taking in the restraints, the tools, the methodical setup of someone who'd done this before. It was exactly what she'd expected to find based on Fleming's behavioral patterns and shopping habits. "Bleach, lime, plastic sheeting, and duct tape," she said simply. "Some combinations you never forget how to recognize." 6 hours later, after statements and debriefings and paperwork that reminded her why she'd left law enforcement, Margaret sat in her car outside Brookshire's market. Her shift started in 2 hours, and she needed to decide whether she was ready to go back to scanning barcodes and asking about paper versus plastic. Her phone buzzed with a text from Special Agent Martinez, the case supervisor. "Outstanding work tonight. The Bureau could use someone with your skills and experience. Interested in coming back?" Margaret stared at the message, then at the grocery store where she'd found unexpected peace after years of hunting monsters. But she also thought about Sarah Winters, who was alive because someone had been watching. Someone had recognized the patterns that others missed. She typed back, "Thanks, but I'm exactly where I need to be." Because sometimes the most important investigations happen in grocery stores, conducted by cashiers who remember too much and see too clearly. Sometimes protecting people means staying in the shadows, watching and waiting for the moment when old skills meet new threats. Margaret Chen went back to work the next morning, taking her position at lane 3 with the same pleasant smile she'd worn for 4 years. But now the other employees looked at her differently, whispered conversations dying when she approached, the kind of awkward respect reserved for people whose true capabilities had been suddenly revealed. She didn't mind. She had work to do, patterns to watch, people to protect. And if another predator made the mistake of shopping in her store, they'd learn what every serial killer eventually discovered. You can run from law enforcement, but you can never hide from someone who truly understands how monsters think. After all, some languages, once learned, are never forgotten.